He was unwanted and lived under a bridge until one unexpected find in the trash changed his life. Inside an old dirty bag, he discovered millions of dollars, and instead of running away or chasing luxury, he chose a path no one could have imagined. Subscribe, share this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Detroit had a way of swallowing people whole, as if the broken factories and rusted bridges were mouths that never stopped chewing. On the city's outskirts, where the streetlights flickered like dying fireflies and the houses stood with boarded windows like blind, forgotten giants, Marcus Hale walked each morning as though drifting through a place that no longer recognized him. The neighborhood had once been full of workers leaving their homes before sunrise, lunch pails in hand, dressed in uniforms that smelled of steel and honest sweat. Now, those same homes sagged under their own weight, roofs caved in, yards full of weeds that curled around chain-link fences like the fingers of the past refusing to let go. Empty lots had turned into dumping grounds, and the silence of abandoned factories hummed louder than any machinery ever had. Marcus remembered when this part of Detroit felt alive. He had once been part of that pulse, a strong, broad-shouldered man who knew the meaning of a full day's work and never complained about the ache in his hands or the grit beneath his fingernails. He would finish his shifts at the steel plant with a kind of quiet pride, the kind that came from knowing he was providing. Back then, he believed that as long as he kept his head down and worked, life would stay steady. It was a belief he held on to with the same firmness with which he held the welding torch that had shaped his days for more than a decade. But life does not promise fairness, and the world he once depended on began to crumble long before he realized it. His wife, Kimberly, had never handled pressure well, although in the first years of their marriage she hid it under pretty smiles and bright dresses. She had grown up wanting more than Detroit's cracked sidewalks and cramped apartments. Early on, she seemed willing to chase dreams with him, proud that he was a hard-working man even if he never made much. But as time went on, the shine in her eyes dulled under the weight of bills, endless repairs, and the absence of anything that felt like prosperity. She wanted stability, a sense of upward movement, something that looked like a future. Marcus gave what he could, but what he could offer slowly became not enough. Everything began to unravel the year his mother got sick. She had always been the quiet anchor in his life, the woman who raised him alone, carrying loads that would have crushed a weaker spirit. When the doctors told them the diagnosis, their words fell like heavy stones. A condition that required medication he could barely afford, regular appointments, tests that ate through what little savings he had managed to build. He took extra shifts, then extra jobs, staying out later and later, coming home so exhausted that his body trembled. He didn't notice at first how Kimberly's patience thinned like stretched elastic, how she stopped sitting up for him at night, how she stopped asking how his day was. He was too focused on the woman who gave him life and was now losing her own. But Kimberly noticed everything: the late payments, the empty fridge, the growing pile of medical bills on the counter. She blamed his mother, blamed the city, blamed him. She said she didn't sign up to watch her life drain away into hospital rooms and prescription bags. Whenever Marcus tried to explain, she cut him off, her voice sharp with disappointment. He kept telling himself it was stress, that once things calmed down, she would soften again. He did not see the moment when her love quietly folded into resentment. The night he came home and found the apartment empty felt surreal, like stepping into a dream he couldn't wake from. The air smelled unusually still. The kids' shoes were gone from the mat, their drawings taken down from the refrigerator. The closet gaped open like a hollow wound, all her clothes missing. On the table lay a note, short and cold, the handwriting unmistakably hers. She wrote that she needed a man who could offer more than struggle, that she couldn't carry the burden of his family anymore, that she and the children deserved better. There was no apology, no explanation beyond that, just a door slammed in ink. Marcus stood there for a long time, unable to move. The apartment, once noisy and warm, now echoed with a silence so deep it felt physical. His heart beat as if trying to break out of his chest, but he made no sound, because grief often steals a man's voice before it steals anything else. He sat down on the couch, holding the note in his hands until the paper softened from the moisture of his palms. In that moment, he understood that something fundamental in his world had cracked. Still, he tried to hold everything together. He continued working, continued paying bills, continued visiting his mother, even as her condition worsened. He brought her flowers when he could afford them and sat by her bedside long after visiting hours ended, whispering stories from his childhood to keep her awake, to keep her here. But life can be merciless even when a man begs for mercy. His mother passed quietly one cold morning while he was on a double shift, welding sparks flying as if the universe mocked the idea of timing. The call came as he wiped sweat from his face, and the world simply dropped out from under him. Her funeral was small. There was no money for anything grand. He remembered how the wind cut through his jacket, how his tears felt hot against the chill, how he stood alone because there was no wife to hold his arm, no children to cling to his side. It was the loneliest moment of his life, and yet the world kept demanding more from him. The bills continued to arrive, stacking like bricks on his shoulders, and with no one left to stay strong for, he began to crumble. Soon, he fell behind on rent. Job cuts hit the plant, and he was one of the many deemed expendable. Without income, without savings, without help, he became another name on a long list of the city's abandoned souls. When the landlord finally forced him out, he gathered what little he owned, a few changes of clothes, a photograph of his children, and his mother's favorite scarf, and carried it in an old backpack. Everything else, the furniture, the television, the small things he once thought mattered, stayed behind for strangers to claim. He spent his first nights wandering aimlessly, sleeping in alleyways, then behind dumpsters, until he found a spot beneath a highway overpass where other forgotten men huddled against the cold. They were like ghosts lingering in the corners of the city, men who'd had jobs, families, dreams once upon a time. Marcus listened to their stories and realized how easily any life could collapse. Some had lost everything because of sickness, others because of addiction, others simply because the world had no place for them anymore. None of them judged him. They had no right to, and no desire. They had all fallen. He set up a small shelter there using scraps he found, a torn tarp, an old mattress stained with age, cardboard to block the wind. In the winter, the cold gnawed at him until his bones shook. In the summer, the heat turned the underpass into an oven. He survived by picking up scrap metal and cans, selling them at a recycling yard for whatever he could get. Some days he earned enough for a sandwich, others only enough for a cheap cup of coffee. Every evening, he pulled out the photograph of his children, the corners worn from handling, and stared at their faces with equal parts love and shame. He wished he could explain to them how things had gone so wrong. He wished he could tell them that he fought, that he didn't give up, but life had beaten him to his knees faster than he could rise. Detroit seemed determined to forget him, but fate doesn't always move in straight lines. It was on an ordinary morning, gray and quiet, that he found something that didn't belong in a place like this. He was searching through an industrial dump site, looking for copper wire or old parts from abandoned machinery. He was tired, hungry, and numb from the endless monotony of survival. Then, at the bottom of an overflowing dumpster, he saw something out of place. A clean, metallic case with a sturdy handle, reflecting the pale light as if it had been placed there moments before. It was too clean, too new, too heavy to be ordinary trash. He stared at it for a long time, torn between fear and desperation. Detroit had taught him that when something looks too good to be true, it usually brings trouble. But hunger, cold, and hopelessness have a way of pushing a man past caution. With a deep breath and a beating heart, he reached into the dumpster and dragged the case out. The weight of it told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't something someone tossed without reason. Marcus carried it back to his makeshift shelter, checking constantly over his shoulder. The closer he came to his little corner beneath the bridge, the more he felt the familiar sting of dread tickle his spine. Whatever was inside that case had the potential to change his life or end it, and all he could do was hope that the world had decided, just this once, to show him a sliver of mercy. When he finally unlatched the case in the dim shadow beneath the overpass, the hinges creaked softly, as though hesitant to reveal the truth. Inside, neatly arranged and gleaming despite the dull light, were rows of sealed metallic cylinders, precise and uniform, like something from a laboratory or industrial facility. In that moment, the air around him changed. The underpass felt smaller, heavier. Marcus didn't fully understand what he was looking at, but he knew, deep in the part of him that still recognized value, that he was staring at something worth more than anything he had touched in years. His story was about to change, though he couldn't yet know whether the change would lift him up or drag him even deeper into darkness. All he knew was that the world had finally placed something in his hands instead of ripping something away, and he could not turn away from it now. For a long moment, after opening the metallic case, Marcus simply stared at its contents as though his eyes struggled to trust what they saw. The underpass around him hummed with the usual city noises, the drumming of tires overhead, the faint echo of horns in the distance, the whisper of trash skittering across the concrete. But all of it seemed strangely muffled, as if the world had suddenly stepped back, given him space to absorb this impossible moment. In his hands lay something that did not belong to a man like him, not in a place like this, not in any reality shaped by starvation and cold nights under bridges. These cylinders, sealed in immaculate industrial plastic, were objects of value, purpose, and secrecy. They radiated a clean sharpness that felt alien amid the dirt, cardboard, and rust that defined his daily life. Marcus reached out and touched one of the cylinders with the tip of his finger. Even through the packaging, it felt dense and cold, unlike any scrap metal he had handled before. He lifted it with both hands and was startled by the weight. Whatever metal it contained was heavier than steel, heavier than anything he had scavenged. His breath hitched. This was no discarded machine part. Someone had deliberately placed or transported these under strict conditions. Objects like these did not end up in dumpsters by accident. He closed the case quickly, as though afraid the gleam of the cylinders might catch the eye of some unseen predator lurking nearby. With trembling hands, he slid it deeper into his tent, adjusting the tarp so that no curious passerby could glimpse it. All the while, he felt exposed, like the shadows were thinner than usual, like every gust of wind carried invisible eyes. He waited for minutes that stretched like hours, listening to the thud of his own pulse in his ears. Nothing happened. No one came. But the dread lingered, coiling tight in his chest. He spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to focus on scavenging. Every time he bent to pick up a stray can or wire, his mind drifted back to the case. A scent of danger clung to it, mixed with the intoxicating possibility of salvation. Hunger had followed him for so long that the idea of having something valuable, truly valuable, felt unreal. It frightened him as much as it thrilled him. He had learned, painfully, that nothing in life came without a price, and the fear that the price would be too high gnawed at him relentlessly. By the following morning, however, survival instincts took over. Marcus knew he couldn't make decisions based on fear alone. He needed information. So, he took one of the cylinders, just one, and wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth. Then, with the caution of a hunted animal, he made his way toward the scrapyard run by a man named Victor, one of the few people who didn't ask too many questions and who paid cash without paperwork. The scrapyard sat behind a chain-link fence on a forgotten side street, smelling of rust, gasoline, and burnt rubber. Piles of twisted metal rose like jagged mountains, and clouds of dust swirled whenever a forklift rumbled past. Marcus approached the small office, its windows clouded with grime. Victor, a rough-faced man with tattoos creeping up his neck, looked up from his desk when Marcus entered. There was curiosity in his eyes. Marcus rarely brought anything of interest, but also suspicion, the guarded look of someone who had seen enough trouble to sense when more was coming. When Marcus unwrapped the cylinder and placed it on the counter, Victor's expression shifted instantly. The man's casual indifference evaporated, replaced by something sharp and alert. He picked up the cylinder carefully, turning it in the light. His face tightened. Without a word, he carried it to the back room, leaving Marcus alone with his thudding heart. Minutes passed. Marcus wondered if Victor was calling someone, if this was a moment when police would rush in or men in dark suits would drag him away. Instead, Victor returned with a look that was equal parts awe and fear. He placed a thick wad of cash on the counter, far more than Marcus had ever seen handed to him. His voice, usually gruff and impatient, came out in a low mutter, as if speaking too loudly might trigger an alarm somewhere in the universe. Marcus understood immediately that the cylinder was valuable beyond anything he had imagined. He didn't need an explanation. The fear in Victor's eyes was explanation enough. Marcus left the scrapyard quickly, stuffing the money deep into his pocket, and walked until his legs ached. Every sound made him jump. Every stranger he passed seemed to look too long. He felt like a man carrying stolen treasure, even though he had stolen nothing at all. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and the shadows grew long, he returned to the underpass with a stomach in knots and pockets heavier than they had been in years. That night, he sat awake for hours, replaying the moment in the scrapyard, Victor's face, the weight of the cash. The case still lay hidden beside his mattress, its contents silently glowing in the darkness, demanding a decision. Marcus's thoughts oscillated wildly between hope and terror. He imagined a future where he had a real bed, where he wasn't cold, where he could look his children in the eyes without shame. But he also imagined police breaking through the tarp, imagined headlines calling him a thief, imagined the rightful owners, people powerful and ruthless, tracking him down. The fear was so real he could taste it. The following day he sought answers elsewhere. He went to a small cafe downtown where televisions were always tuned to local news channels. He bought a cheap coffee with trembling hands and sat near the screen. That was when he saw the report. A large scientific research facility outside the city had reported a massive theft. Several employees were under investigation, and a federal task force had been assigned to track down stolen materials described as specialized platinum-based industrial components, highly valuable, tightly regulated, and essential for complex manufacturing processes. The anchor described them almost exactly as the items Marcus had seen in his case. The stolen property was worth millions, maybe tens of millions. Marcus stared at the screen, his throat dry. Every detail lined up. Every syllable felt like a nail sealing his fate. It was suddenly clear that what he had found didn't belong to criminals hiding loot. It belonged to criminals powerful enough to steal from federal-level research labs. Criminals who would not shrug off the loss. Criminals who would eventually come looking. He left the cafe in a daze, struggling to walk straight. The winter air slapped his face, but it didn't clear his thoughts. He returned to the underpass and sat before the case, resting his shaking hands on the cold metal. The truth loomed over him like a storm cloud. He was in possession of something dangerous, something that tied him to a crime too large for someone as invisible as he was. But he was also in possession of something miraculous, something that could lift him from the dirt and restore his dignity. A long time passed before he opened the case again. When he finally did, he didn't see metal anymore. He saw possibilities. He saw a path out of the life that had trapped him for so long. He saw a chance to reclaim everything he had lost, piece by fragile piece. He understood the risk. He understood the price. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt like life had extended him a hand instead of pushing him deeper into the ground. He decided he would not use it recklessly. He would not draw attention to himself. He would not suddenly buy a house or show up in new clothes. He would stay small, unseen, silent. He would sell only enough to begin standing again. Never too much, never too fast. If danger came, he would be ready. But he refused to let fear be the only force shaping his destiny. Over the next week, Marcus sold another cylinder, then another, spacing out the visits, changing the route he walked each time. With the money he earned, he rented a bed in a shelter, where he could sleep without worrying about the wind or the rats or the footsteps of strangers approaching in the night. He paid for a medical checkup at a clinic where the doctor, surprised to see a man in such condition who actually had money, diagnosed him with an advanced respiratory infection caused by years of cold and damp. Medication helped him breathe without wheezing for the first time in months. He purchased clean clothes, sturdy boots, and a new backpack to replace the torn one that had been his only possession besides the case. He bought a cheap prepaid phone, something he hadn't owned in years, and used it to call a community center that offered free vocational courses. Welding, repair, and mechanics. Skills he once had but needed to restore if he ever hoped to work again. He spoke to counselors who helped him start the process of recovering lost identification documents. When the new ID arrived weeks later, he held it in his hands as though it were a passport to a forgotten version of himself. He moved forward quietly, carefully, each step measured. But inside him, something had begun to thaw. A dormant strength resurfaced. The strength of the man he used to be before the world had taken everything. For the first time in years, he felt not only alive, but capable of rising. He still feared the case, feared the origin of the wealth he was using, feared the shadow that followed him now. Yet, with every breath that didn't hurt, with every night of sleep that didn't freeze him to the bone, he felt himself standing a little taller. Marcus knew that he was only at the beginning. The road ahead was long, and its twists were unknown, but he held on to one truth with all the fragile hope inside him. He had been given a chance, and he was determined not to waste it. The weeks that followed became a strange mix of fear, discipline, and steady progress, as if Marcus were walking on a tightrope stretched between two worlds. Behind him lay the life he had known too well. Cold nights under the bridge, hunger gnawing at his ribs, failure heavy in every breath. Ahead of him shimmered a new life, one he didn't fully trust but couldn't stop reaching toward. Each day he moved forward with careful steps, never forgetting the weight of the metallic case hidden beneath his cot at the shelter. It was both a lifeline and a threat, a gift wrapped in danger. Yet Marcus understood that if he used it wisely, if he controlled his impulses and held himself to discipline, he might finally climb out of the darkness that had consumed him. He began attending welding classes at the community center, arriving early and sitting in the back with quiet determination. The classroom smelled of chalk and old machinery, the kind of place that reminded him of what he had once been, before life had shredded his confidence. At first, his hands trembled slightly when he picked up the welding torch, as though they were wakened from a long sleep. But muscle memory returned faster than he expected. His instructors noticed the steadiness in his movements, the precision with which he approached even simple tasks, and soon he stood out among the trainees. Some of them were teenagers lost in boredom. Others were middle-aged men trying to start over like him. Marcus kept to himself, speaking only when asked. But every time he struck an arc and saw sparks leap to life, he felt something inside him reignite as well. His progress wasn't limited to welding. He enrolled in additional courses on basic auto repair and diagnostics. He remembered enough from his years on the job to pick things up quickly, and within weeks he was helping other trainees who struggled with the material. The instructors, most of whom had seen countless men and women attempt to rebuild their lives only to fall again, felt something different in Marcus. He had the look of someone who had been broken but refused to stay shattered. Whenever they handed him a new challenge, he accepted it without complaint or hesitation. It took time, but gradually the shelter became a stepping stone rather than a prison. Marcus followed its rules meticulously, waking before dawn, keeping his bunk tidy, volunteering to help clean whenever he could. The staff trusted him. They saw the seriousness in his eyes, the way he treated every task, no matter how small, as if it were a rung on the ladder out of misery. He ate warm meals now, meals that filled his stomach rather than merely stopping the ache. He slept under a solid roof, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of detergent instead of mold. For the first time in years, his body began to heal. The cough that had tormented him disappeared, his strength returned, and his mind grew sharper, no longer fogged by hunger or cold. Despite these changes, fear remained lodged inside him like a splinter. Every time he returned to the case, every time he sold one of the cylinders, he felt his pulse quicken. He continued visiting Victor, the scrap dealer, but always cautiously. He varied the days, the hours, the paths he took. He wore different clothes, kept his head down, and spoke as little as possible. Victor never pressed him for details and never mentioned the cylinders to anyone, but the silence between them had become heavy, thick with unspoken understanding. Marcus sensed that Victor knew how dangerous these transactions were. The amounts the man paid him grew smaller over time, not because the cylinders were worth less, but because Victor feared drawing attention. Marcus accepted this without complaint. He wasn't trying to get rich overnight. He was trying to survive without losing himself. With each careful sale, he set aside a little more money. He didn't squander it. He didn't drink or gamble or show it off. Instead, he saved steadily, like a man preparing for a long winter. Bit by bit, he accumulated enough to think about renting a small space, a garage perhaps, where he could put his welding and automotive skills to use. The idea frightened him. Starting a business meant stepping back into the world, becoming visible again, risking failure in a new way. But it also meant reclaiming the dignity he had lost piece by piece since the day his wife left. The next phase of his journey came almost unexpectedly. One of his instructors recommended him for a part-time job at a small auto repair shop on the city's edge. The owner, a stocky man named Harris with kind eyes and a gruff voice, was hesitant at first. He had heard too many stories, seen too many people show promise only to crumble under pressure. But something about Marcus's calm, focused demeanor persuaded him. He agreed to let Marcus work a few shifts a week, unpaid at first, to see what he could do. On his first day, Marcus arrived early, his stomach tight with nerves. The shop was old, its equipment battered, the smell of oil and rubber thick in the air. Harris put him to work sweeping floors and organizing tools, tasks most new workers despised. Marcus embraced them without complaint. He cleaned every corner meticulously, arranged tools in straight lines, wiped down countertops until they shone. Harris watched him with a raised eyebrow, surprised by the diligence. After a week, the man decided to test him with actual work. He asked Marcus to change the brakes on an old sedan, a job that required patience and skill. Marcus completed it smoothly, checking every bolt twice before calling Harris over. Soon, he was doing more complex repairs, brake lines, suspension adjustments, engine diagnostics. Customers noticed the quiet new mechanic who worked with precision and never tried to upsell them things they didn't need. Some even waited specifically for him when they brought their cars in. Harris hired him officially after 2 months, paying him a modest but steady wage. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the pride of receiving a legitimate paycheck. Every day after work, he returned to the shelter and studied late into the night, determined to sharpen his skills further. The fear of being discovered still lingered, but it no longer crippled him. Instead, it pushed him to be careful, thoughtful, and disciplined. He continued selling the cylinders rarely and discreetly, relying more on his earnings than the hidden fortune beneath his cot. The case became less of a lifeline and more of a silent guardian, watching from the shadows as he rebuilt himself. As the winter turned to spring, Marcus found himself considering a dream he had once believed belonged to another version of him. With his savings growing, he began searching for a workspace of his own. It didn't have to be large or fancy, just a garage where he could fix cars honestly, offering fair prices to people like the man he used to be, people who had no money but needed someone trustworthy. He scoured listings until he found a dilapidated garage near the edge of a neglected neighborhood. The building was barely standing, its roof patched with mismatched panels, its concrete floor cracked and oil-stained. Most people would have called it hopeless, but Marcus saw potential instead of decay. He saw a place where something new could grow. He rented it after negotiating a low monthly price with the landlord, a weary woman who seemed grateful someone was willing to use the place at all. For several weeks, he worked tirelessly to bring the garage back to life. He scrubbed the walls until they no longer smelled of rot. He dragged out piles of broken parts and rusted scrap. He repaired a leaking pipe, patched a hole in the wall, and installed lights he found at a salvage store. Each task was a reminder that he was building something with his own hands, something real, something that no one could take away from him again. When the shop was finally ready, Marcus hung a small sign outside. White letters on black paint, simple and understated. Hale Auto Repair. He felt his heart swell as he stood before it. His name had never meant much to anyone before, but here it stood as a declaration that he had survived. At first, customers trickled in slowly. Most of them were locals who lived nearby and couldn't afford expensive repairs at commercial shops. They came skeptically, expecting to be overcharged or cheated. But Marcus treated every job with honesty and meticulous care. He explained what needed fixing without embellishment and charged only what was fair. Word spread, people returned, some brought friends. Others slipped him extra money, saying they were grateful to finally have a mechanic who didn't treat them like fools. Harris, his former employer, even stopped by one afternoon leaning on the doorframe with an amused grin. He told Marcus he was proud of him, that not many men could crawl up from where he had been and stand this tall again. For Marcus, that acknowledgement meant more than he could express. The growth of his shop brought new emotions, both comforting and unsettling. For the first time in years, he laughed occasionally, shared friendly conversations with customers, and felt a warmth inside his chest that wasn't weighed down by sadness. But along with this warmth came a whispering emptiness, a reminder of what he had lost along the way. His children's faces haunted him at night. He wondered what they looked like now, whether they remembered him, whether they hated him. He wondered if Kimberly had found the stability she sought, or if she still blamed him for everything that went wrong. Despite the ache in his heart, Marcus pressed forward. With every small step he took, the gap between who he had been and who he was becoming widened. The case still remained under his bed, wrapped in old blankets, its presence a dark star that pulled at him constantly. But the more he built with his own hands, the less he needed it. Yet, beneath all this progress, a faint unease remained, an instinct that told him this new life was fragile, that the past would not let him go so easily. And though he tried to silence the thought, part of him knew the truth. A storm was coming. The early months of Marcus's new life unfolded with a steady rhythm, one that felt almost miraculous in its normalcy. He woke each morning with purpose, unlocked the doors of his modest auto shop, breathed in the scent of motor oil and clean metal, and set to work before the sun had fully risen. Customers trusted him, the neighborhood respected him, and his hands, once numb from cold and hunger, had regained the strength and steadiness that defined his youth. Yet, beneath this surface, calm was a tension he could never quite ignore. It was as if the metallic case still under his bed created a low hum that only he could hear, a constant reminder that nothing he built stood on entirely clean ground. He told himself that the life he was reconstructing was honest, that every hour he worked, every dollar he earned now, was free of that shadow. But shadows have a way of stretching into places we believe to be safe. And Marcus knew, deep in his chest, that sooner or later his past would find a way to knock on his door. The first sign of this came through the television in the corner of the garage, an old, dust-covered thing mounted crookedly to the wall. It played the local news throughout the day, more for background noise than anything else. Marcus rarely paid attention to the reports, focusing instead on engines, brake pads, and diagnostics. But one afternoon, as he wiped grease from his hands, a familiar phrase caught his ear. The anchor was discussing new developments in the platinum component theft investigated by federal authorities. Marcus froze mid-step, his heart pounding as though someone had reached inside his chest and squeezed. He turned his head slowly toward the screen. The report detailed how the FBI had arrested several individuals connected to the theft, uncovering evidence of a sophisticated operation involving insiders at the research facility. According to the anchor, several stolen components had not been recovered. Investigators believed they might have been transported or hidden before the thieves were caught. The stolen items were described again: high-density, platinum-based industrial cylinders, sealed in specialized plastics. The anchor's voice was calm and polished, but to Marcus it sounded like a verdict. He stood rooted to the concrete floor, the rag in his hand slowly balling into his fist. The world around him faded. The sound of the pneumatic tools in the back bay dulled into static. For a long moment, he could hear only the beating of his own pulse. He forced himself to breathe, long and steady, trying to ground himself in the present. He reminded himself that the case was still hidden. No one had followed him when he took the cylinders to Victor. No one had questioned the small, carefully spaced transactions. Victor had remained silent, and the news now focused entirely on the indicted conspirators, not the missing items. This should have been reassuring, but Marcus felt far from reassured. Instead, the report shook something deep within him that had long been dormant. A fear he had managed to suppress since climbing out of homelessness now resurfaced, raw and furious. It whispered that everything he had built stood on borrowed time, that at any moment the world might collapse again, leaving him with nothing but regret. He shut off the television, but the silence felt heavy. For the rest of the day, he worked mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Customers noticed he seemed distracted, though he forced polite smiles and fixed their cars with the same diligence as always. But inside, a storm was growing. When he locked up that evening, the weight of the keys in his hand felt both reassuring and terrifying. He had created something meaningful. He had clawed his way back from the darkest place a person could fall. But the thought that all of it might be snatched away in an instant wrapped around his throat like a vice. He returned to the shelter, though by now he rented a small room in a nearby building, pulled out the metallic case, and stared at it in the dim lamplight. It felt different now, heavier than ever. The cylinders inside no longer looked like salvation. Their polished surfaces reflected the truth he didn't want to acknowledge. They were stolen, and in keeping them, he had tied his fate to a crime, even if he hadn't committed it himself. He felt a chill climb his spine, but he couldn't turn back time. He couldn't undo the role the case had played in his survival. Without it, he would still be sleeping under the bridge, shivering, starving, perhaps dying. He closed the case, placed his hand on its lid, and whispered to the empty room that he would honor the life it had allowed him to rebuild. He vowed he would use the remaining contents only sparingly, cautiously, and only for good. Then he slid it back into its hiding place, trying to bury the fear along with it. But fear, once awakened, rarely sleeps again. And the very next morning it returned in a form Marcus never expected. The auto shop had just opened when a battered silver sedan pulled into the lot. The engine sputtered as though gasping for breath, and the car wobbled to a stop with a squeal. Marcus grabbed a clipboard and stepped outside, expecting to greet a stranger. But when the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out, the world tilted beneath him. His breath caught, his muscles stiffened, and for a moment he could not move. Kimberly stood before him. Her hair, once styled with care, hung limp around her shoulders. Her clothes, fashionable years ago, were now worn and faded. But it was her eyes, those bright eyes that had once looked at him with affection, then with contempt, that struck him the hardest. There was no shine in them now, only exhaustion. Behind her, two teenagers climbed out of the car, children he'd last seen as toddlers. They were taller than he imagined they would be, their faces older and sharper than the soft-cheeked memories he had held on to. They looked around uncertainly, whispers of embarrassment flickering in their expressions. For a second, no one moved. Time folded in on itself, bringing back memories like knife wounds. Kimberly packing up silently, leaving the note on the table, walking out with the children without looking back. The nights he spent alone. The days he wondered what he had done wrong, what more he could have given. The crushing loneliness that hollowed him until he felt more like a shadow than a man. Kimberly opened her mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest like a trapped animal. Finally, she spoke in a voice much quieter than he remembered. Life had worn her down too. "Marcus, we need help." The tremor in her voice was real, not manipulative, not rehearsed, real. Yet even as the vulnerability in her tone echoed across the lot, Marcus felt old wounds tear open inside him. She had not come to him when he was dying under a bridge. She had not come when he begged silently for support as he lost his mother, his home, his place in the world. She came now when he stood in front of a business he had built with shaking hands and years of struggle. She came now when he had finally risen. And though the father in him longed to embrace the children and never let them go again, the hurt in him, the man who had been abandoned, rose like a tide. He motioned them inside the garage, knowing this conversation could not happen in broad daylight where customers might overhear. The shop suddenly felt too small to contain the emotions swirling within him. The children stood near a workbench, fidgeting, unsure of how to act around the father who had become a stranger to them. Kimberly sat on a metal chair, her back slumping as if she carried an invisible weight. She explained what had happened. After leaving him, she had met someone who promised her the stability she thought Marcus could not provide. At first, life with the new man was comfortable, even luxurious. But years passed, money dwindled, and the man she'd chosen over Marcus revealed a cruel, selfish side. He left her burdened with debts, responsibilities, and two growing children. When the bills piled too high, when her landlord threatened eviction, when there was no one left to turn to, she remembered the only man who had ever truly cared for her. She confessed this with a voice full of trembling shame. Marcus listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched her with an expression that was neither anger nor forgiveness. It was something older, heavier, a kind of exhausted clarity that comes only to people who have walked through fire and survived. When she finished, the room grew still. The children looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. One of them held the strap of a torn backpack so tightly his knuckles whitened. Marcus finally spoke, and his voice was low but steady. He told her that he had been alone when he most needed his family. He told her that he had begged silently for someone to believe in him, someone to stay. He told her he had wandered through hell with no support, no comfort, no hope. And now that he had built something, now that he could feed himself, now that he stood on stronger ground, she returned. Not for him, for survival. Kimberly cried quietly. She didn't argue. She had no defense. Her choices had consequences, and only now did she fully understand them. Marcus turned to the children. Their faces were etched with uncertainty, conflict, and a sadness they could not express. He felt something inside him soften, not toward Kimberly, but toward them. They were innocent. They were pieces of him, pieces he had missed desperately for years. He could not punish them for their mother's decisions. He could not let them fall through the cracks as he once had. He told Kimberly that he would help the children, ensure they had a place to live, clothes to wear, food to eat, and a chance at a better future. But the wall between the two of them, the wall she had built with her abandonment, could not be torn down. Not now. Not ever. He said it gently, without cruelty, but firmly enough that she understood completely. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words like someone swallowing shards of glass. She accepted the arrangement because she had no right to demand anything else. In the days that followed, Marcus found them a modest apartment not far from his shop. He paid the first few months of rent in advance, stocked the kitchen with groceries, and bought school supplies for the children. He even took them shopping for clothes, though the experience felt both joyous and painful. They warmed to him quickly, sensing the genuine care in his gestures, and Marcus found himself rediscovering the quiet joy of fatherhood he thought he had lost forever. And yet, as he returned each night to his own room, the emptiness crept in. Old wounds that had scarred but never truly healed began to ache again. He felt pride in helping his children, but an unexpected heaviness lay beneath it. A reminder of everything he had missed, everything that had been taken from him. Nights passed slowly, filled with memories he had spent years trying to bury. At the same time, the presence of Kimberly stirred a different fear. Her reappearance reminded him how easily life could shift without warning. He worried that his fragile peace might fracture again. He worried that someone might connect him to the missing platinum cylinders. He worried that one day there would be a knock at the door that would undo everything. And so he worked harder, pushing himself until exhaustion blurred the edges of his thoughts. He poured his energy into the auto shop, his children, and the responsibilities he had taken on. But no matter how he tried to outrun it, the shadow of the case remained behind him, stretching longer with each passing day. Marcus had reclaimed much of the dignity he lost, but the past had returned to remind him that healing is rarely simple. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face of someone you once loved. Sometimes it demands forgiveness you are not ready to give. And sometimes, even after you climb out of the darkness, the air still carries the scent of ash. He didn't yet know it, but this chapter of his journey, the chapter that began with a stolen case and led him back to his own children, was only the beginning of a greater transformation. The storm, he feared, was not here to destroy him. It was here to shape him. The days that followed Kimberly's return moved through Marcus's life like a slow, heavy tide. Nothing collapsed, nothing exploded, yet everything inside him felt unsettled, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted without warning. He continued his routine with mechanical steadiness, opening the auto shop each morning, greeting customers, repairing engines, but beneath that surface rhythm lived a quiet turmoil he couldn't escape. The reappearance of the family he had once lost brought a warmth he had forgotten, yet it also tore open wounds he thought had long healed. And every time he returned home to his sparse room and saw the metallic case hidden beneath the bed, he felt the same old weight pressing against his chest. The world had changed around him, but the shadow of the past still followed his steps. He tried to ignore that shadow, to bury it under work and responsibility. He spent evenings helping his children settle into their apartment, bringing over groceries, teaching them how to perform small repairs around their new home. They were shy at first, uncertain about how to behave with the man they barely remembered. But children have a way of sensing sincerity, and Marcus's heart had room for them even after all the years of distance. Slowly, cautiously, they warmed to him. His son asked him for help with math homework. His daughter laughed when he told her stories about the mischief he used to get into as a child. And when they hugged him goodbye after one of his visits, he felt something inside him tremble, an ache that was both beautiful and painful. Yet even in those moments of unexpected tenderness, the presence of Kimberly was like a cold breeze through a half-open door. She rarely spoke unless she had to, and when she did, her voice carried a restrained sadness he couldn't decipher. Her guilt, though real, did not erase the past. It lived between them like a wall of cracked glass, fragile, dangerous, and impossible to repair. Every time Marcus looked at her, he felt a complicated weave of emotions: resentment for the years he suffered alone, compassion for the hardship she had endured since, and a quiet resolve not to let the past re-enter his heart. He could help her survive, but he could not let her break him again. The shop became his refuge. He threw himself into work more intensely than ever before, arriving earlier, leaving later, pouring every mental and physical strain into each repair. And for a while, that helped. Sweat blurred the edges of his thoughts, and the steady rhythm of tools kept darker memories at bay. But as the adrenaline faded each night, he found himself lying awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. His life had changed. He had fought to rebuild it. But the fear he carried for so long remained unresolved. It was during one of these hollow nights that he first noticed a woman who would change the direction of his life. She appeared on an ordinary afternoon, driving a faded blue car that coughed and wheezed as it coasted into the lot. The front bumper was cracked, the engine sputtered like an asthmatic, and one of the headlights flickered weakly. Marcus expected the driver to be someone irritated or dismissive, someone who saw his small shop as a last resort. But when she stepped out, the world around him seemed to still for a moment. She was slender, with gentle eyes that held an exhaustion he recognized instantly, an exhaustion that came not from laziness but from fighting too many battles alone. She introduced herself simply as Allison. There was nothing dramatic in the way she spoke, no hint of rehearsed charm or exaggerated urgency. She explained that her car had been giving her trouble for weeks, but she couldn't afford the fees at the larger mechanics in the city. She had heard about his shop from someone who said he treated people fairly. That small admission touched Marcus in a place he hadn't realized was still tender. He had spent so long trying to rebuild his life quietly, humbly, honestly, and now, for the first time, he sensed that reputation taking shape around him, forming a gentle circle of trust. He inspected her car and realized the repairs would cost more than she could comfortably pay. But instead of panicking or bargaining, she simply sighed in a way that wasn't dramatic or self-pitying, just tired, as though she had accepted that life often demanded more than she could give. Something about that sigh pierced Marcus deeply. It reminded him of the way he once breathed when loss weighed too heavily to bear. And without thinking twice, he offered to repair her car for the bare minimum, enough to cover parts and only a small portion of the labor. Her eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering in their depths. Then gratitude. Then something softer. Trust, perhaps. He repaired her car over the next few days, staying late after closing hours to finish the job. Allison returned each evening after work to check on the progress, sometimes bringing him a cup of coffee or a small container of homemade food. They talked, not the way strangers talk, fumbling for topics, but the way two weary souls talk when they recognize something of themselves in the other. She told him about her young daughter, about raising her alone after her husband passed away from a sudden illness, about juggling 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. She didn't complain, didn't seek pity. She stated facts plainly, with resilience woven through every word. Marcus found himself drawn to her, not through desire at first, but through understanding. She had endured loss, too. She had stood alone in storms, but she hadn't let bitterness consume her. She worked. She cared for her daughter. She helped others where she could. There was a quiet strength in her that made Marcus feel strangely seen, as though she understood him in a way no one else had in years. When he finally finished repairing her car, she insisted on paying him more than he had asked. He refused. She insisted again. Eventually, he accepted a modest additional amount, recognizing that to deny her contribution would be to deny her dignity. They shared a brief, sincere smile when she drove away, her car now humming instead of coughing. And when she disappeared from view, Marcus felt an unexpected warmth settle in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Allison began stopping by the shop occasionally, sometimes with a minor concern about her car, sometimes simply to say hello. Her daughter, a curious little girl with bright braids, occasionally accompanied her and would wander around the shop asking questions about tools and engines. Marcus found himself smiling more often in those moments, his heart softening towards something he had not given himself permission to feel in years: connection. The more he spoke with Allison, the more he understood how deeply her presence affected him. She had no agenda, no hidden motive, no connection to the past that had wounded him. She was a woman carrying burdens of her own, but she carried them with dignity and courage. She saw him for who he was now, not for the broken man he had been before. Gradually, this recognition awakened something new inside him, a desire not just to survive or rebuild his own life, but to create something meaningful for others as well. He thought about the homeless men still sleeping under overpasses, the single mothers struggling to provide, the young people trapped in cycles of poverty because opportunity had never knocked on their door. He saw them through Allison's eyes, not as failures, not as burdens, but as people whose stories mattered. People who needed someone to believe in them, just as he had once needed that himself. The metallic case under his bed, once a source of fear and temptation, began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer simply a secret or a lifeline. It became a tool, a resource he could use not to enrich himself, but to uplift others. He realized that no matter how hard he worked, the life he was building could never fully escape the shadow of how it had begun. But perhaps through intentional kindness, through careful choices, through generosity born from hardship, he could transform the origins of his fortune into something cleaner, something truer. With that resolve, Marcus began to quietly help those who needed it most. When a local elderly couple's roof collapsed during a storm, he paid to have it repaired. When a teenage boy from the neighborhood showed interest in learning about cars but couldn't afford classes, Marcus offered to teach him for free. He bought food for families in need, covered medical bills for a few who couldn't afford treatment, and donated tools to trainees at the community center. He did all of this silently, avoiding attention. He didn't want praise, nor could he bear the scrutiny that attention might invite. Helping these people didn't erase the fear, but it dulled its edge, replacing it with something steadier, a conviction that he was finally becoming the man he wanted to be. It was during this period of quiet generosity that the idea of a community center began to form in his mind. A place where people could learn trades, receive support, eat warm meals, and find a path forward. A place for people like him. A place that would have saved him had it existed during his darkest hours. He imagined a welcoming space filled with tools, workbenches, classrooms, and tables where people could gather, skill by skill, step by step, to rebuild their lives. The idea grew roots quickly. Marcus found an abandoned warehouse just a few blocks from his shop, a crumbling structure with shattered windows and graffiti-covered walls. Most saw it as a public nuisance. Marcus saw potential. With money saved from his shop and careful, sparse use of the funds that remained from the case, he purchased the building from the city for a negligible sum. Renovation began slowly, at night and on weekends, with Marcus doing much of the work alone. Eventually, some of the men he had hired at the shop began helping him. Allison, too, showed up occasionally, painting walls and organizing donated supplies with quiet determination. As the center took shape, word spread through the neighborhood. People began to come, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, to volunteer or simply see what Marcus was creating. The promise of free meals, classes, and job training attracted many who had long been ignored by society. Marcus didn't turn anyone away. He hired instructors, bought equipment, and created a space where hope felt real, not just a distant dream. Allison supported him through every step of the process. Their connection deepened, no longer rooted solely in shared experiences of hardship, but in mutual purpose. Whenever she smiled at him, he felt something inside himself ease, a sense that perhaps, after all the pain, he might finally deserve peace. When the center finally opened, it wasn't marked by a ribbon-cutting ceremony or political speeches. Instead, it began with a warm meal shared between strangers who needed comfort. It began with Marcus handing out tools to men who had forgotten what it felt like to be trusted. It began with a mother thanking him through tears because her son finally had a place where someone believed in him. It began with small acts of kindness that together created something monumental. Local news outlets eventually learned about the center. They filmed a short feature about a former homeless man who had risen from nothing to build a haven for others. Marcus watched the segment once, sitting alone in his room, feeling conflicted as the reporter praised him. He didn't want fame. He wanted to erase the stain of that metallic case forever, not draw attention to it. But as he watched the faces of people at the center, faces full of hope, he understood that the story wasn't about him. It was about them. And maybe that was enough. His relationship with Allison became a gentle, steady bloom. They never rushed anything. Both had been wounded deeply by life and knew that real connection required patience. They spent evenings talking softly in the quiet of the shop or walking through the neighborhood, watching the city lights flicker as though signaling new beginnings. Through her, Marcus found the courage to accept that he could build a life not just for others, but for himself. A life with warmth, companionship, and meaning. And every time he looked at what he had built, his shop, his children's safety, the community center, he felt the embers of hope glowing stronger. But beneath all this growth, change, and healing, a truth lingered quietly, waiting for the moment it would be called to the surface. The stolen cylinders still remained beneath his bed, a reminder of the fragile thread connecting his past to his present. And though he rarely touched the case anymore, he knew it was still part of his story, a chapter not yet fully resolved. He didn't know what the future would bring. But for the first time in years, he faced the uncertainty not with fear, but with purpose. The opening of the community center marked a turning point in Marcus's life, one that he sensed even if he could not fully articulate it. For years he had been moving carefully, almost hesitantly, building each new layer of his existence with the caution of someone who feared it might crumble with the slightest misstep. But now, as people streamed into the center each day, some seeking food, others guidance, others simply a place where they were not invisible, Marcus felt a shift inside himself. Something in him had begun to settle. The center had not erased his past, nor had it freed him from the weight he still carried, but it had given him a sense of direction that allowed him to breathe more deeply, to stand a little taller, to believe that he might finally be moving toward peace rather than away from disaster. He spent long nights in the warehouse turned haven, fixing tables, repairing loose pipes, or simply watching the people who gathered there. He observed the teenage boy who eagerly devoured every lesson on engine repair, a boy who reminded him so painfully of himself at that age that Marcus sometimes had to step away to swallow the surge of emotion. He watched the elderly homeless woman who came each day just to sit in a warm room for an hour, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as if it anchored her to the earth. He saw single mothers sharing quiet conversations in the corner, leaning on each other in ways that made him think of Allison and everything she had endured alone. The center had become more than a project. It was a living manifestation of everything Marcus wished he could have found during his darkest moments. Life, however, has a way of reminding even the most hopeful soul that peace requires more than good deeds. It requires closure. It requires the courage to face what one has tried to outrun. And so it was that only a few months after the center opened, the news once again brought Marcus face to face with the shadow he thought he had buried for good. He was closing the shop late that evening, sweeping the floor as was his daily habit, when the faint sound of a television reporter's voice drifted from the waiting area. He normally turned the TV off before locking up, but a customer had left it on, the screen illuminating an empty chair with its bluish light. Marcus moved to switch it off, but froze as the words reached him. The anchor was speaking in that familiar rehearsed tone, reporting that the federal investigation into the platinum theft had finally concluded. The criminals responsible had been convicted. Sentences had been handed down, and most importantly, according to the anchor, authorities had made the decision to close the search for the remaining stolen components due to insufficient evidence and the likelihood that they were destroyed or transported beyond recovery. Marcus stood perfectly still, the broom hanging loosely in his hand. The shop seemed utterly silent except for the reporter's words echoing in his mind. Closed. The investigation was closed. They weren't looking anymore. The missing cylinders, those strange, heavy pieces of metal that had changed the trajectory of his entire existence, were now considered irretrievable. If there had ever been a threat of the law catching up to him, it had vanished. The storm he had lived beneath for so long had simply dissipated. He turned the television off, but the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses on the ears, making every heartbeat sound like a drum. For years, Marcus had lived under a cloud of fear, believing that at any moment his past might claw its way back and destroy everything he had built. Now that the danger had passed, he realized that fear had become part of his daily rhythm, woven into the fabric of his life. And he did not know how to exist without it. He walked home under a sky thick with stars hidden behind the glow of the city, their dim shimmer barely visible. When he reached his room, he closed the door behind him and sat on the bed, staring at the spot beneath it where the metallic case lay hidden. He had touched it so rarely in recent months that dust had begun to gather along the edges. He did not reach for it now. Instead, he sat motionless, hands resting on his knees, and allowed himself for the first time to truly consider what it meant that he was free. Freedom, he realized, was not a sudden burst of joy. It was a quiet unshackling, a gentle release, a space in which he could finally breathe without the taste of fear in his mouth. And with that realization came something unexpected, a sense of responsibility deeper than anything he had felt before. He understood now that his life no longer depended on the contents of the case. He had built something honest, something lasting, something that did not need to be propped up by secrets. His business sustained itself. The community center had funding and volunteers. His children were safe, fed, and beginning to rebuild their relationship with him. The case, once a symbol of survival, had become obsolete. In that moment, he felt a resolve settle over him like a warm blanket draped across his shoulders. He stood slowly, walked to the bed, and pulled the case from its hiding place. It was lighter than he remembered, perhaps because his hands were steadier now, or perhaps because the fear that had once amplified its weight no longer controlled him. He carried it outside into the night, its metal surface cool against his palms. He walked through the neighborhood with quiet steps, passing shuttered storefronts and dim streetlights that flickered like tired eyes. The streets were empty, the world asleep. When he reached the old overpass, the place where he had once slept, once starved, once nearly frozen to death, he paused. The space looked smaller now, almost unfamiliar. The concrete pillars loomed above him, covered in layers of graffiti that told stories he didn't recognize. The makeshift shelters had shifted, some abandoned, others occupied by faces he did not know. The past lingered in the corners, but the man who had lived here no longer existed. He had walked out of the underpass years ago, but tonight he was finally walking away from what had kept him trapped inside it. He placed the case gently on the ground beside one of the pillars. He did not open it. He did not need to. He simply rested his hand on it for a moment and whispered a quiet thank you, not because the case had brought him fortune, but because it had given him the chance to learn who he truly was. Then he straightened, took one last look at the metal box that had defined so much of his journey, and turned away. With each step he took, he felt lighter. The following weeks brought a calm unlike any he had experienced in his adult life. Without the weight of fear shaping his every decision, his world expanded. He found himself laughing more often, real laughter, not the tight, cautious chuckles he used to hide behind. He deepened his connection with his children, taking them out on weekends, listening to their stories about school, helping them prepare for tests. They were beginning to trust him not as a distant figure from old photos, but as a real presence in their lives. The bond was fragile, still delicate in places, but it was growing, thread by thread, strengthened by time and consistency. His relationship with Kimberly remained unchanged, respectful but distant. She found work through a friend of a friend, and though her life was still difficult, she approached it with a humility that had once been absent. Marcus did not blame her anymore. He had released that burden. He knew that forgiving her fully would take time, perhaps a lifetime, but he no longer carried the sharp sting of betrayal. It had dulled into something quieter, a reminder of who he had been and who he chose to become.